To start off with, I kind of just want to give you some information on sort of who we are, where we are, and all that kind of thing, because I know I'm a little bit outside of, our typical area here in Orange County. It works. All right. So first of all, we're located in the sort of eastern part of Stafford County today, and historically, eastern part of Stafford County, western part of King George. The map here, you'll see. Hold on, let me get this working. There we go. Fredericksburg is right there. I think we probably mostly know where that is. Our Museum and Cultural Center is located just east of Fredericksburg, downstream on the Rappahannock River. If you get a chance, you should come by and see it. We're open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, noon to 5. The sport self-guided tours. And then during the season from April to October, we are open the first and third Saturday of every month from April to October from 10 to 2. And you'll get a tour that's more guided by a docent if you're interested in that kind of thing. Presently, our tribal community is situated mostly around White Oak, which is this little sort of crossroads area in Stafford County, not too far from our ancestral villages along Patawomeck Creek up here. All of this stuff, though, like through here, is within about 3 or 4 miles of each other, which is actually a pretty interesting thing when you think about a group of people, particularly Virginia Indians. Oftentimes, you tend to associate Virginia Indians with one body of water, but the peninsula between the Patawomeck and the Rappahannock River is so narrow there that we really took advantage of both bodies of water. And you've got two very different environments there. Patawomeck Creek, it's a little brackish. Crabs come in there in the summertime, so there's a lot of folks that crab these days, and in the past as well. Things like sturgeon would come through there. And then when you get to the Rappahannock Falls, which is where Fredericksburg is, it's freshwater, completely freshwater, but it's a choke point because it's the fall line, and so it's a great place to catch anadromous fish like herring and shad and stuff like that. So pretty unique environmental situation there. Okay, so I'm going to try to keep to my notes so I don't go like too far off kilter here, but I am going to make some asides like that one I just did for you. So traditional crafts associated with Virginia Indians have drawn the attention of colonists, collectors, anthropologists, and material culture researchers for hundreds of years. The vast majority of those crafts have a connection to traditional foodways systems, and they serve as major aspects and signifiers of tribal identity and continuity from sort of the pre-European times to the present day that are recognized both within and outside of Native groups. And so two examples of that you might have heard of here in Virginia include Pamunkey pottery, which has been made for many hundreds of years, and the Pamunkey still make a very well-known type of pottery today. And then also Rappahannock baskets, something that's maybe less well-known, although the Rappahannock had a highly developed basketry tradition up into sort of the middle of the 20th century that has since then sort of gone dormant. But I'll talk a little bit about those as we get through the presentation here. But another type of object, and the one that I'm going to talk about today, that has a deep history and is intertwined with the culture of Patawomeck people is the white oak eel pot or the split oak eel pot. And it's a specific type of woven eel trap. So I'm going to talk about the pots, how they've come to symbolize and contribute to our persistence as a community in the face of modernity and colonialism. So what is an eel pot? I think is a good question to start with. In its basic form, it's a type of basket and it's a trap that's used to catch eels. It's woven on 2 separate molds and it's woven out of split white oak splints. The 2 pieces are then joined together. So you can see in the image here, there we go. Top corner, these are the 2 molds. These are 2 historic molds that pots were woven on in our community. And then there I am weaving on a mold. I'm going to get to some slides that show the steps, like in terms of making one. But on average, they're 21 inches tall. They measure about 8 inches in diameter at the base and about 6 inches in diameter at the mouth. The larger end of the base is open and it has a funnel. And that's what provides access to the interior where the eel would go into. And then the smaller end, what I call the mouth, can be closed off with a removable wooden plug or cork. And then that cork is attached to the body of the eel pot with a rope. And the rope, which you can kind of see in the image here wrapped around it, you see it not only attaches the plug so that it doesn't get lost, but it also provides like a little bit of a tag in, because when you fish them, you attach the eel pots to a longer line. So once the pots are woven, they're then dipped in tar, and that turns them a black color. So a lot of the historic Patawomeck eel pots that you see will have that dark color to them, and that's because they're dipped in tar. And it's done for a couple reasons. One is to preserve the pot and make it tougher and stronger. You got to remember, these things are going in and out of the water all the time. They're getting hit up against the side of the boat and stuff like that, so they need to be tough. And then there's also folklore within our community that suggests that tarring pots makes it more attractive to eels, because eels prefer dark places. I will say, though, that there are lots of Algonquin groups up and down the East Coast that used eel pots and made eel pots, and we appear to be the only community that consistently tars them, and those other communities were catching eels as well with their pots. So I think it's perhaps less about the color of the pot and more about the know-how that goes with fishing them that really contributes to catching eels. But the pots are tarred. We tar them. They're tarred before every season when we go fishing. And that sometimes results in these thick layers of tar on historic eel pots. So if you ever see a historic example, if you examine it closely, sometimes you'll see like real buildup of tar, and that suggests that that pot's been fished over and over again, multiple seasons. If it's tarred and it's properly maintained, eel pots can last decades. I've got a couple pots that are from like the 40s, 50s time period, and if you wanted to, you could throw them in the water and fish them today. The way that they're fished is that you put bait in them, so you don't just sink them like with nothing in it. You put bait in the pot through the mouth there, and you close it up. And the bait can be different things, depending on time of year and what the eels are taking. Some of the things we use up in Patawomeck Creek include peelers, which is a type of soft crab, bunker, which is a fish that's called a menhaden. Razor clams work as well. And then early in the season, when the shad are running, roe shad work really well, because that's what the eels are eating at that time. So you throw the bait in the pot, sink the pot to the bottom of the creek or the river, and then the eel hopefully swims into the funnel and gets caught in the pot. And then you pull the pot up. Usually you leave them out overnight, pull it up the next morning, and then you can dump whatever you've caught into a barrel or a bucket you've got in your boat there. And then once the eels are caught, they're either eaten, and they were eaten for thousands of years, and eaten well up into the 20th century and still eaten today by some folks. Or more commonly these days, they're used as bait. Starting sort of in the late 19th century, they become a really important bait for catching crabs on trot line particularly. So salted, eels are salted and used as bait. And then today, they're often used as bait for sport fish like cobia or rockfish. And then also in the middle of the 20th century, there's this big market that opens up for eels in Asia and continental Europe. So a lot of the watermen at home and elsewhere were catching eels, and they were shipping them overseas and making good money on them too. So I'm going to run through some slides here real quick that just kind of show the steps of making an eel pot and kind of explain sort of how that process works. So as I said, they're made on a mold. They're made from these split oak, splints or pieces or weavers or whatever you want to call them. And in this series of photographs, I'm starting with the funnel first, and I'll build the funnel, and then I'll build the body, and I'll put them together. But you can see here, I'm using a hose clamp to hold those pieces on to the funnel there. Historically, the thing that would have been used would have been either another piece of split white oak kind of wrapped around there to hold it tight, or a rubber inner tube would have been used as well. But a hose clamp works really well, serves my purposes, and you can get the same end result with it. So what you do is you've got to get those, I call them ribs, the vertical parts of the pot have to go on first. A weaver might call them warp. So the warp goes on first. On an eel pot, you weave continuously around it, which means that you kind of take one piece and join it to the next to keep it going, so it kind of spirals up or down it. And in order to do that, you need an odd number of ribs. If you have an even number, you won't end on the right spot, so you won't be able to overlap. We use 13. A lot of other communities, eel pots that I've examined, they also use 13, but that's, you don't have to use 13. You could use 11, you could use 15, you could use 7. It just has to be an odd number. So once you get them on there, and you can see once you get all 13 on there, it's pretty tight. It's a little crowded on it. So you got to get them spaced even where you can work around them. Then you start weaving with what I call weavers, which are the pieces that go around and actually do the weaving. Somebody who is like a weaver on a loom or something might call that weft. So you're weaving around that, joining everything together. You keep on going till you get down to the bottom there. And then when you get to the bottom, what you've got to do is you've got to pull your funnel off, and then you take those ribs that are hanging loose and you fold them back up into the weave. So that keeps everything tight. And then you move on to the body. Body works the same way as the funnel in terms of how you weave it. You have ribs, you have weavers. You just go around till you get to the top of it. You can see I'm going through there and doing that on the mold. The only thing that's different about the body, at least for us, is that when you get toward the top, sort of the last third, so the top third of the eel pot, you kind of start to move to these weavers that are generally narrower than the ones that you've used otherwise. And that's because your pot constricts toward the mouth, and using those narrow weavers helps that constriction. It helps to put more pressure on those ribs and pull it tighter. So that's why that's used up toward the top there. When you get to the end, you have something on the mold. I hope I didn't turn that off. That looks kind of like that. And then what you have to do is that has to come off of the mold. That can be tough to come off the mold because with the funnel, it's got that shape to it. It kind of wants to spring off the mold, so it's easy to come off. This really holds tight to the mold, particularly if you weave tight like I do. So sometimes you have to let it dry a little to get it off, or you have to like really hit it to knock it off of there. But you get it off the mold, and then the next thing you do is you fold those ends back into the weave. And on the body, when you do that, you put an extra piece in there that we call the ring. And the ring is captured when you fold those ribs over. And what that ring does is it gives you sort of an anchor point to be able to tie everything together. So it makes it a little tougher so that you're not pulling on the weavers and maybe pulling the pot loose. You're anchoring onto something that's held in tightly. And that can be one of the toughest parts, actually, of weaving the eel pot, because those ends can be kind of stiff and they're a little dry by that point. So you really sometimes got to fight them to get them to work. Here, I'm putting the funnel into the body. When you put the funnel into the body, you put it in, and then you take a long piece, a long strip of split white oak, and you kind of come in and out of those, of where that last weaver comes in and where that ring is, and you sort of wrap it around tight to hold it all together. And then you can see here, I've finished weaving the funnel into the body there. And the tag end right there, I've kind of tucked into the weave of the funnel. When it dries a little bit, I'll come back and cut that so there's nothing in the way of the funnel. You don't want anything to discourage an eel from going into that funnel, so you don't want anything to obstruct it. Then you've got more or less a finished eel pot. You can see at the mouth, it's not quite finished. It's got the ring in it, but then you got to come in and put two more rims up at the top. There's an outer rim and an inner rim. The reason it's reinforced at the mouth there is because that's where that plug goes in and out all the time. And when that pot's in the water, everything swells up and that plug gets held in there tight. So when you pull it out of the water, a lot of times what you do is you pull your pot up on the side of the boat. You got to like hit it against the side of the boat to knock that plug out. And so all of that, like, you know, beating and banging will tear up the top of that pot. But if you put those two rings in, it reinforces it. And then if something breaks, it's easy to replace a ring and not have to rebuild the whole pot. That's another reason we do it on a mold, because if something breaks, you can just make one part. You don't have to make like an entire pot again to fix things. There's the pot finished. You can see it's got the mouth of it finished there, and then the mold sitting down there below. Okay, so now to like sort of the history and culture stuff. Within the Patawomeck tribe, eel pot weaving and eel fishing was a widespread tradition. There's historic references that trace it back to the period immediately after the Civil War. And there's oral traditions that suggest a much deeper history, in addition to some archaeological evidence and ethnographic evidence. Citizens of the tribe, who are, as I mentioned, based in eastern Stafford and western King George, around Patawomeck Creek, fished for eels using these woven white oak pots up until the 1970s. The use of these pots was effectively outlawed in Maryland waters as early as 1980, and in Virginia waters by 1990 through mesh size requirements. Mesh size requirements were instituted for eel pots at that time because of an effort to help conserve a declining eel population. By sort of the mid-1970s, the eel population really begins to decline and the catch really begins to decline. And to help combat that, the Virginia Marine Resources Commission and the Patawomeck Fisheries Commission did things, and in addition to Maryland, where they sort of put a limit on the mesh size of your pot. So you can see, because of that, they went to these wire pots around that time, and that's where you can control the mesh size. In a split oak eel pot, you weave it tight, but with these, you've got openings where tiny eels can get out, and so they thought that would help the eel population. The wire pots generally functioned in the same way as the split oak pots. You know, they have a funnel in them and the eel goes into the body and it's caught. And they started to be used by Patawomeck watermen as early as the 1940s. That's when wire pots kind of started to come onto the scene. But the transition to those modern traps wasn't really completely adopted until the fishing laws forced the issue. And then by the early 1990s, eel fishing among Patawomeck people had really ceased, primarily due to the fact that those overseas markets that I mentioned for eels had kind of dried up at that point. It reduced the profitability of eels, and then the eel population had declined so much by that point that people started to shift to other species to make a living. So as a result of that change in economy and the growth in the region in general, crafting traditional eel pots began to die out. And by that time, there was really only one traditional maker left, and that was, his name's Carl Boozy Schoen. Boozy's what everybody calls him. And he's actually still a waterman, still out there fishing every day. And around the turn of the 21st century, so early 2000s, sort of mid-2000s, mid-aughts, two citizens of the tribe, Mickey Sheneman and D.P. Newton, who are actually pictured here, began to revitalize the eel pot making tradition. And they helped to continue to teach the craft to tribal citizens and display it at public events. They put a lot of effort into renewing the tradition. They recreated and preserved traditional manners of weaving and innovated on the traditional manner of weaving to kind of make it a little bit easier to display to the public and teach folks. And they did it through both trial and error, as well as seeking guidance from older members of the community from the previous generation who had fished those pots, like Schoen and some others who were still around at that time, who were obviously the last folks to really make eel pots and fish them for commercial and subsistence purposes. And then Sheneman and Newton carried that tradition on publicly at tribal events until about the mid-20-teens when Sheneman passed away. And at that point, the tradition began to slow again. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But first, I want to give a little context on sort of the deeper history of eel pots, sort of how they're made and how they fit into sort of the basket weaving and fishing traditions of Virginia Indians. Obviously, prior to the arrival of Europeans, Patawomeck people and Virginia Indians in general used several different fishing methods that we know from archaeological evidence, as well as ethnohistoric accounts, and included things that we are all very familiar with today, like hooks and lines, net fishing, weirs, which are like a type of, I've got a picture of one in here. That's a weir, but it's sort of a structure that's built in the water to funnel fish to a certain spot. Matter of fact, I think there's still a couple in the Rapidan River for you Orange County residents that you can still see today. And then also traps were used. So things kind of like eel pots, but not exactly the same form as what the eel pot is today. Patawomeck people also ate all kinds of seafood during that period. Eels tend to be less common in the archaeological record for coastal Virginia Indians, although their presence is noted in ethnohistoric accounts. And they do show up in archaeological sites, just not to the extent that you might expect for a species that scientists estimate made up to a quarter of the total biomass in the Chesapeake Bay, which is huge if you think about it. So that maybe suggests that there's some kind of like either recovery issue in terms of how we do archaeology when it comes to eel bones, or that it may have to do with the preparation of eels, that perhaps their bones aren't showing up in archaeological sites for whatever reason. Jury's still a little bit out on that, but to be fair, fish bones aren't always that well represented at archaeological sites, and usually that's due to recovery and to things like acidic soils that eat them up over time. In terms of ethnohistoric accounts, One of the earliest images of coastal Algonquin people from John White shows people in North Carolina, same language group, slightly south of here, but there's no reason to believe that, similar cultural patterns shouldn't be up in this region. Anyway, it depicts a funnel style trap. In this image right here, you can see this is sort of a combination of like a weir / funnel thing going on. And then it also depicts a couple eels in this image, and I'm kind of far away, but I'm going to try to remember where they were. I think there's one just below that weir. It's like a little thing, kind of looks like a snake. It's supposed to be an eel. And then actually the person that's in the front of that boat there, if you look just below them, there's a little eel in the water there too. So clearly, the English recognized that eels were important to indigenous subsistence when they got here. After Europeans arrived, Potomac fishing methods really didn't change all that much. In a general sense, Potomac people still fished in a lot of the same ways. We used hooks and lines, we used traps, we used nets, and we used weirs to some extent. That started to die out over time. The thing that did change was the materials. That's what changed. Things like iron and steel came along to make hooks with. Cotton and nylon came along for fiber to make nets and, to also use for lines, for fishing lines. And then I think maybe the most noticeable thing is that the type of watercraft changed. Things went from dugout canoes to ships like skipjacks and skiffs. And nowadays people are fishing out of fiberglass boats for the most part. Of particular interest, once the Europeans came along and indigenous people began to sort of adjust to that new world, is the fact that fishing began to eventually take on a more commercial role over time, as opposed to a strictly subsistence-based practice. And that's notable particularly for the generation of Potomac people who lived through the Civil War. And I don't think I have to tell folks who live in Orange County either. There was a lot of devastation, a lot of forest clearing, a lot of livestock and things that were destroyed or lost during the Civil War. And so when people kind of came back into the area where they were from after the war was over, it was tough. It was a tough economy. It was hard to kind of kickstart things. For us, we turned back to the water. That was something that hadn't been heavily impacted by Army occupation over time. And so it's what brought a lot of people back, after the war, and were able to kind of repair the economy in the area. And that move toward commercial fishing was also aided by increased steamboat traffic along the Potomac River throughout the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. And of course, those steamboats moving up and down the river increased market access in faraway places. Commercial fishing also brought many Potomac families through Reconstruction and the Depression. And it helped to rebuild the economy within our community. And then it led to the modern heyday of eel pot weaving and eel fishing among the Potomac people. So as I mentioned, talked a little bit about at the beginning how eel pots tend to be something that we have historical references for dating the period after the Civil War. The form we see today is something that really coalesces in the period after the Civil War. But I'm going to talk a little bit about basket weaving after I've talked about fishing here to kind of give you an idea of how that tradition of weaving is something that is sort of continuous. So oral history concerning basket weaving among the Potomac people, with the exception of eel pot weaving, is perhaps less prevalent or less well known within our tribe. Although it does exist, there are other examples of Potomac baskets that are passed down through families and basket weavers within the tribe who didn't just make eel pots. But like fishing, basketry has also been an important part of Potomac culture throughout history. Evidence for pre-European basketry among Middle Atlantic coastal Indian groups is generally scant, really, and that's primarily due to preservation-related issues. Natural materials just don't last in these acidic Virginia soils. We don't have the arid conditions with caves and stuff like they do in the Southwest, where you can find woven materials that in some cases are thousands of years old. But we do have some archaeological examples that point to weaving and point to basketry. And they occur when the perfect conditions can exist. So if you have like a piece of a woven mat or a basket that perhaps rested up against something like a piece of copper, in the archaeological record, that will help to preserve small pieces. So we do have small pieces. And then in some cases, we have impressions on clay pots that would suggest weaving. or some type of basketry. But really, most of the evidence we have of pre-European basketry comes from the documentary record and early ethnohistoric accounts. Those accounts tended to indicate that baskets were made of either things like grass or folded bark or maybe bark splints, and that weaving was done in a relatively simple 1/1 weave, or that baskets were twined. And so in the image here, that's a couple folded bark baskets right here, which are still made. Here's a twine basket. This is a grass basket right here. It's also different, the sort of pre-European basketry, because apparently all of it was done freehand without the use of molds. And Europeans, in their ethnohistoric accounts, tended to place basketry in the woman's sphere of work among Indian groups. And that actually stands in contrast to the Patawomeck eel pot tradition, which both documentary evidence and and oral history indicates has been in the realm of men primarily, within our community at least. So like fishing, basketry changed after Europeans arrived, although it changed a little bit differently than fishing did. But it is the same in that new technologies and new techniques were incorporated once Europeans came on the scene. And some of those things include the oak splint tradition and the use of molds. While white oak is a native tree here, it does not appear to have been used in the pre-European past to make baskets with in the way that we do today, where we split it out and weave it. That seems to be something that Europeans brought over. They had an oak basketry tradition, and when they came over, they brought that tradition with them. And then the use of molds to make baskets on. As I mentioned, ethnohistoric accounts don't indicate that molds were used prior to the arrival of Europeans. But we do know that Europeans were using molds to make baskets. And so that's probably something that was adopted by indigenous people over here. But ultimately, like fishing, those changes don't suggest that native basket forms didn't persist. Only the way in which the baskets were made changed over time, and that their materials adapted to the new technology and those new techniques that were introduced and brought over by Europeans. The persistence of native basketry in the Chesapeake region was well documented by researchers and institutions such as people like Frank Speck from the Smithsonian in the early 20th century and others. Here in this image at the top, I mentioned Rappahannock baskets. All these baskets at the top are early to mid 20th century baskets from the Rappahannock Indian community that were collected by people like Frank Speck. And I believe all of these are actually at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History now. The Rappahannocks had a highly developed basketry tradition, and they used lots of different materials, including split oak. They used grass, they used corn husk. There's a pine cone basket up there, and then I think honeysuckle as well. I'm not sure if there's a honeysuckle one on there, but I believe they did use honeysuckle as well for their basketry. So lots of different natural materials, and this sort of mixture between European forms, European techniques and technologies, and then more what people might consider traditional indigenous techniques or materials. When visiting the Patawomeck people in the early 20th century, Speck and other researchers collected several examples of eel pots, as well as a large white oak basket, which is right here. And then these are Patawomeck eel pots right here in the middle that are held in the Smithsonian collections. And the white oak basket I always find kind of interesting because if you kind of pay attention to how it's made, very similar in terms of the construction techniques to the eel pots, which would suggest that, that's the style of basket that we were making. In addition to those two forms, though, citizens of the tribe also made white oak baskets that more closely resembled European forms, to include things like ribbed egg baskets and gathering baskets. And then we also made pine needle baskets as well. And those things remain in family collections. The Smithsonian didn't really have a lot of interest in those, I think because they didn't think they looked Indian enough for them, even though the pine needle baskets have a long indigenous tradition. But anyway, this is one of the ribbed egg baskets right here that was made by one of our tribal citizens. And actually, there's a lot of those through the community. That basket maker was very prolific in his time. So when those collections of native baskets were being gathered in the early 20th century, eel pots weren't only collected from the Potomac people. So I don't want you to think that eel pots are just a Potomac phenomenon here. There are several coastal Algonquin groups that have eel pot traditions that stretch from Maine all the way to the Chesapeake and even down into North Carolina. And eel pots were not exclusive to indigenous groups either. There were people, African American watermen would use them. White watermen would use them. Just about anybody that fished had access to an eel pot. But there are very few traditions carried on within a community, and that's, I think, which speaks more to the indigenous aspect of it. But some of the groups that have examples in collections like the Smithsonian include the Piscataway, who are over in Maryland, across the Potomac River from us, the Nanticoke, who are on the eastern shore of Maryland and Delaware, the Shinnecock, who are Long Island up in New York, and the Penobscot, who are in Maine. And those are examples of pots from each of those communities, in addition to a Potomac pot down there in the bottom left corner. The eel pots appear to have been particularly prominent among the Nanticoke people, and they regard them as an important part of their identity, and they even feature an eel pot prominently on their tribal flag. So, as you would expect, the strong eel pot tradition among Atlantic coastal tribes exhibits measurable variation in form. I'm an archaeologist. I like to measure things and look at patterns. So, this is what I'm going to look at a little bit. And those variations in form and treatment provide important clues to cultural identity and traditions over time. But as for the Potomac eel pot, its origins, its deep origins, and its path to its current form are a little bit mysterious, although gathering all this information, we know much more than we did at one point. It's quite likely that some form of woven fish trap has always existed among Potomac people, whether it was an enclosed form or just maybe a large funnel. That thing that changes over time. The eel pot as it exists within our tribe today, being constructed on a mold out of white oak splints, probably didn't really come about until after Europeans settled the region, bringing steel tools, which are really important for splitting white oak. If you've ever done it, it's something that would be exceedingly difficult to do with stone tools, and also wouldn't make a lot of sense when you've got other great materials that are available and almost as tough and easily workable with sometimes you don't even really need stone tools for things like river cane and stuff like that. And so the Europeans also, obviously brought the steel tools, they brought the oak splint basket tradition and the method of weaving baskets on the molds. But that form that the Potomacs came up with and used and adopted was passed down through families that fished within the Potomac tribe for generations, just as their ancestors had done in many of the same places their ancestors had fished for hundreds of years. By the late 19th and early 20th century, the families recorded as making eel pots included the Newtons, the Bullocks, and the Greens, some of whom also continued to make other types of baskets. Starting around World War II, the Potomac eel pot experienced another major shift in relation to changing economies and technologies as the construction material began to shift away from white oak splints to metal wire, which was a cheaper, faster, and easier method for watermen who were looking to cash in on selling eels in a burgeoning Asian market that happened in the sort of middle of the 20th century. Interestingly, though, wire eel pots had existed in the Chesapeake region from at least the 18th century, and we know that based on an example found at the Addison Plantation site in Maryland, an archaeological site that was identified by the folks at Jefferson Patterson Park in Maryland. And that's the fragment that was found right there. And then this is a whole one that's held in a museum collection of what it would have looked like in the 18th century. Despite this, the Potomacs chose to continue to use the oak splint form for generations, perhaps as a way of maintaining our connection to more traditional practices and as an act of resistance to European culture. I mean, wire was cheap. It's not like people couldn't afford to go get wire and use it, but instead they chose to go out there, find these white oak trees, first of all, which is tough to do, cut them down, split them, which takes a lot of time and effort, and then weave their own pots. If you could go buy a roll of wire and do that. It's a whole lot cheaper, saves a whole lot more time. So there's a reason that people continue to do this over and over again. As the 20th century wore on and the economy in the area around the Potomac homeland shifted away from farming and fishing, the eel pot tradition started to die out before being revived at the early 21st century by direct descendants of some of those same early 20th century eel pot makers. I'm going to get into a little bit of archaeology here real quick because this is obviously of interest to me. When we view it at a broader scale, the Potomac eel pot, I think, also offers some tantalizing clues about the deep history of Potomac people and our ties to other coastal Indians in the region. So I mentioned that there's a strong tradition of eel pot making among the Nanacoke, among northern coastal Algonquin tribes, particularly the Nanacoke, who are on the eastern shore of Maryland and Delaware. And that's particularly significant if we view it in relation to the fact that Potomac people appear to have migrated into Stafford County around 1300 AD, or really that's when the community coalesces in these villages that pop up. And archaeologists have posed several hypotheses as to the origins of Potomac people. So they include origins with groups of people from the northern Piedmont regions, from modern day New York, sort of upper Susquehanna River Valley area, and the Eastern Shore. And the Eastern Shore hypothesis is supported by some oral history that's recorded in the colonial period in Maryland that suggests that the Potomacs had very strong bonds with these groups, were part of a larger confederacy, and were actually ruled over by somebody from the Eastern Shore in that sort of 1300 time period. And the oral history mentions that all of that happened 13 generations previous to when it was recorded. Well, it was recorded in 1660. And if you kind of figure out a generation is about 20 years and you go 13 of those back, that gets you to around that 1300 AD time period. And so obviously among those Eastern Shore groups are the Nanacoke, the other tribe with a major eel pot making tradition that survived into the 20th century that Frank Speck wrote a little monograph about. And there's an image of a Nanacoke eel pot maker in the top left corner of that slide there. So it's maybe a footnote to the other evidence that archaeologists have brought to bear for that hypothesis on Potomac origins. But I think it's important to realize that more recently, historians and archaeologists have come to understand that native ways of knowing have much to contribute to our interpretation of the past. And I would say that while I'm, in this case, focusing on a single and somewhat esoteric object, I would argue that the Potomac eel pot tradition suggests a strong influence from the Eastern Shore groups and maybe even more northern coastal groups, indicating cultural affinity, alliances, or maybe even shared ancestry that long predates the arrival of Europeans in the region. Just a hypothesis, but something I think that's like very interesting in terms of who's making these pots and how long they survive, and where different things are showing up. So now that I've given you sort of that background historical context for eel pots, I want to turn to some more recent developments in eel pot making and its future within the Potomac community. So I'm an eel pot maker. By the time that I began to learn the craft in the winter of 2018, 2019 timeframe, D.P. Newton and Boozy Schoen were the two last traditional eel pot makers within our community. A few other members of the tribe had worked with DP on aspects of eel pot making, but none were really making pots in the traditional manner anymore. DP became my mentor in eel pot making, and we finished our first eel pot together in the spring of 2019. And then during that time, so we went out and like cut the tree, like he taught me how to do all of it, all the way to the end of it. And then I was going on and making my second eel pot like on my own. And in October of 2019, DP passed away when I was working on my second one. And so his passing for me highlighted the fragile nature of that craft. And it encouraged me to become more serious in handing the tradition down and teaching other people within the community how to do it. But also in better understanding how they're entangled with our identity. I think we all understood as a group of people that fishing, and particularly eel pots and eel fishing, were an important thing for a long time. But, I don't think we really fully understood the history of eel pots and how it fit in with sort of the larger context of Virginia Indian communities. And so as part of that, with the help of the Potomac Tribal Council, I started an eel pot class in the winter of 2020. And in that class, the idea was to basically teach tribal citizens how to do this again, like from the beginning all the way, like finding the tree, cutting it, doing all that stuff, all the way to the end. And it's intensive. It's intensive to do that kind of work. And the winter of 2020 was a great time to start, right up until we got to COVID. And then we couldn't get together anymore. And you got to be together to do this kind of work. It's the kind of thing that you have to be with people to learn how to do it, and to really understand like the process. So we had like 2 classes, I think, and then it was a big class, had like 10 or 12 folks in it, depending on the day. And then we had this big hiatus. And during that hiatus, we lost, like, people dropped off. Life got in the way. They didn't come back to the class. So a class that started off with 10 or 12, by the time we were finally able to start meeting again and finish up pots, I had 2 students that finished. It's labor intensive, and I think it can be discouraging when you're making them. You start off in the woods cutting trees, and you really don't end up with anything that starts to resemble an eel pot until you're like 2 hours away from being finished. And that can be discouraging to a lot of people who just kind of want to have something to take home with them. So that didn't work, and that happens. So I started to kind of go back to the drawing board on that one, and then I was like, well, maybe the way to do this is to do it like how our ancestors did it, to really like be one-on-one with people and show them how to do it in a small group, or something like that. So as part of that, I sought a Virginia Folklife apprenticeship. And what that is Virginia Folklife hosts these apprenticeships where it has somebody who knows the craft and teaches it to people, oftentimes within the same community, but not always, who want to learn the craft and learn it in an intensive way. And so they support that. So we were part of that, the 2022-23 Virginia Folklife Apprenticeship class. I was the teacher on that one, and I had 2 apprentices, 2 young tribal citizens that I taught how to make eel pots from the start to the beginning. And so now they know how to do it. And since then, I've kind of refined my teaching method and switched to more of like a workshop as opposed to an intensive class for folks that just kind of want to get an introduction to it. In 2023, Virginia Humanities funded an eel pot workshop for us. And so myself and one of my apprentices taught this workshop down in Irvington to other citizens of Virginia Indian tribes, as well as educators who work with Indian tribes. And that was successful. We did small eel pots, like little miniature half-scale ones, and I had prepped all the material ahead of time, so all they had to do was weave. And they really liked that because they had something to take home at the end of the day. But they learned, because they were still working with the material, they learned kind of how tough the material was, how tough it could be to work. We did a little bit of demonstration on how to split it, but then we really just wove pots. And did a little bit of introduction, like history and everything too. So that was really successful. And so that's kind of the model that I have taken on to now. And actually, I've kind of started to shift over to commercial reed as opposed to split white oak, because it's easier to get your hands on. And if people really just want to learn how to put it together, that's easy enough to do, and it's expedient. So it works for that. Although I'm still open to tribal citizens who want to learn it from start to the finish, doing one-on-one things with them if they're ever interested. But in addition to that sort of teaching part, I'm also continuing to collect data and record examples. There are examples of historic eel pots within our community, and there's actually a photograph here. You often think that eel pot kind of belongs in the water being fished. Well, not anymore, obviously, because there's not a lot of people that do that anymore. The natural habitat of the eel pot these days is actually something more like that, in somebody's shed in their backyard, like in a pile of stuff where you kind of can't even really tell there's eel pots in there till you look hard. So that's what I've been doing, is talking to former watermen, their families, going and recording examples of eel pots, taking measurements, taking photographs. As part of that, there seems to be some variation where you can tell who the makers were, and that's kind of cool. And also just to look at the pots and kind of see which ones have been fished and which ones haven't, and sort of the life, the life use they've had over time. So now, the Patawomeck eel pot primarily exists as a traditional craft, in some ways for its own sake, rather than as an important part of our economic or subsistence system. Nobody's out there making a living off of catching eels with split oak pots in our community anymore. Now, there are still people that catch eels. My brother spent this summer eeling, but he was using wire pots. It remains a way to display and reinforce Potomac identity, and it acts as a form of resistance against European aspects of culture and identity in the region that tend to emphasize mass production, efficiency, and speed. Those three words don't really jibe with split oak eel pots, if you've ever worked with them. But the work of crafting the eel pot is necessarily slow. It requires skills learned through practice and mentorship, and it lends itself to passing on oral histories and knowledge from generation to generation, as the Potomacs always have. And arguably, I would say that fishing does the same thing. So it's not just eel pot making, it's fishing too, that it also passes on traditions. Partially because of this, the object itself has played a major role in keeping Potomac culture alive in the face of violent social, economic, and cultural upheavals that have defined Native existence since the arrival of Europeans. And in this way, the eel pot's an object of survivance, in that it's nurtured Potomac people, Potomac ways of knowing, despite centuries of European onslaught. Like the Potomac people, the object has persisted and grown, perhaps shifting in form or materials over time due to specific conditions, but always part of a Potomac story. As our Chief Emeritus, Robert Greene, has noted on several occasions, like our language, the eel pot is integral to Potomac culture. It links us to our ancestors, it links us to our environment, and it's imperative that we pass it on to the next generation. So that's kind of what I've got on eel pots. There's certainly more I could talk about with them. And if you've got questions about them, I'm happy to answer them. So thank you. Oh my goodness, somebody. Well, so they're coming back, actually. So they declined pretty heavily in the 70s. And through the 80s and 90s, the population was fairly low. And in the early 2000s, but now they're starting to come back with their population. There are people that are eeling again. As I said, mostly being used for bait now. That's what people are selling them for. But, you know, there have been lots of hypotheses as to why the population declined. And it's probably really a combination of things. Overfishing is probably one of those things. Also, the health of the waterways. In the 70s and 80s, the Chesapeake Bay was not in the best health, nor were the tributaries. So that, caused harm to a lot of different species, not just eels. And then also the introduction of invasive species like blue catfish. And I think anybody that kind of has any connection to watermen or to commercial fishing these days sort of has a sense of the impacts of blue catfish. A lot of people talk about blue catfish today as being particularly impactful to the crab population. They eat a lot of crabs, but they eat a lot of everything. They're like garbage disposals. And blue catfish are not a native catfish, and a lot of people don't realize that. Blue catfish aren't native to this region. They were brought here from out west as like a sport fish, and they kind of took over. There are catfish that are native in these waters, but the blue catfish have really outcompeted them for the most part. They're voracious eaters. So it's really probably the combination of those things that led to the decline in the eel population, and the increased health of the waterways, I think, is helping the population come back, in addition to probably some of those regulations they put in on mesh size. And in general, the fact that they became less profitable, so less people fished for them, so there's not as many being pulled out of the water. But eels are a really cool fish. I think a lot of people don't realize they're a catadromous fish, which is the opposite of a shad. A shad comes up into the freshwater to spawn and goes and lives its life in the ocean, whereas an eel lives its life here in the freshwater and goes out to the ocean to spawn. And so we have to be careful as the eels are coming back not to catch a lot of the small ones, because when you pull those out of the population, you don't have anything to grow up to be bigger ones over time. And there are 2 fisheries in Maine and South Carolina that allow fishing for glass eels, which are like the little teeny ones that are coming back from the ocean, which demand a huge price, but it's really detrimental to the eel population. So luckily we don't have that in Virginia or in Maryland, but it's a thing that could potentially impact the eel population again. So did that answer your question? Was that kind of what you were going for?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
That farm manager on our farm, he constantly talked about eating eels and said, put a hair on your chest. And then I haven't seen one in the Rapidan in years.
Yeah, so they can certainly come up the Rapidan. I mean, when the dam was down at Fredericksburg, that was the other thing that kind of impacted eel population is the dams and rivers. It's hard for eels to get past them. But so many dams have been blown up now, and then also things like fish ladders and eel ladders have been put in to help the eels and other types of fish get upriver. Yeah, they can definitely come out here. And I have a friend of mine who's Monacan, and she talks about her grandparents talking about catching eels in Amherst, which is where they're from, and using them as like to tie their hair with, like the skins to tie their hair with. So they were catching eels up there. And that's pretty far upriver. So eels move really far upriver. Yes.
Yeah, I'm curious about the use of the tarring and the genesis of that and why some groups did it and some groups didn't.
Yeah, why some groups do it.
Is it availability or?
I don't know. It shouldn't be availability. So actually it's road tar that we're using. So this is one of those European things. Like this is after the Civil War, you got to remember. So people in our community were usually going up to Baltimore and they were getting big drums of tar and bringing them back. And there's actually an image. Let me go back to it real quick. But anyway, they would go up to Baltimore, they'd get these big drums of tar, and they did something that you really should not do with tar. Yeah, here you go. So this is a modern day tar pot, kind of. And what we use today is what's called net set, which is essentially road tar. It's basically the same stuff, you know, if you look at the ingredients. But you can cut it with like you can cut it with a solvent to make it thinner if you want to. And a lot of fishermen today dip their nets in that, helps preserve it and keep like the gunk and stuff off of it when you're fishing it. And the eel pots you can dip them in as well. But here is a historic eel pot, or a tar pot, I mean, or tar trough. The way they would do it back in the day is they get that big like drum of tar and they'd pour it in that trough and they'd start a fire under that trough. Heat it up to get it thin to dip stuff in, which is super dangerous because if that tar catches fire, like that's bad.
How did they get the idea of using tar?
I don't know. That's a good question. That's a good question. You know, it's been used by commercial fishermen for a long time on their nets.
They didn't use it before the introduction of.
No, no, there's no evidence. Yeah, there's no evidence that before like road tar came along, anybody was treating them. Yeah. But so, you know, in terms of access, I mean, anybody would have had access to that potentially. So why the other communities didn't use it, I can't really speak to that one, but we certainly did. And we used it to the extent that like you don't see a Patawomeck eel pot that's not dipped in tar unless it wasn't finished being made, you know. We've got an example in our museum that was collected in the 1960s, and it hasn't had the funnel put into it yet, and so it hasn't been dipped in tar. But it's really, I think I've seen like maybe 2 Patawomeck eel pots that are historic that weren't dipped, and that's why, because they weren't finished yet. Ray.
You showed a slide of the fish weir.
Yeah.
A few minutes ago.
Yeah.
And in the Rappahannock, at the falls and upstream of the falls, there are 2 really good examples. One is a somewhat ruinous example of a fish weir there beside the Falmouth Bridge, kind of between that island that's in the middle of the river and the Fredericksburg side. But there is a much better, much more intact, much more pristine looking example about Banks Ford, which is maybe a mile upstream of the falls, that spans the entire channel. You know, the nice, well-defined V shape funnel would have funneled the fish and the other river aquatic resources, you know, down to that opening. And here in the Rapidan, there's at least one that I know of that's, you know, between Orange and
Just about Eagles Forward.
yeah, which is also in a really good state of preservation. And it's kind of one of those combo fish weirs. It's not just a V shape; it's maybe the W.
Oh, okay.
Shape,
Yeah.
Fish weir. There may be a second one as well, far closer to us here in town. But also, I was wanting to know, in your survey of existing eel pots from people's garages and attics and
Yeah.
storage rooms, what kind of variation have you seen, and what kind of numbers have you seen of those eel pots that have just been squirreled away, in somebody's house for 30, 40, 50 years?
Yeah. So in terms of variation, now I was talking about the different makers. And so I've relied pretty heavily on Boozy Schoen, who is the one that he learned from his grandfather and made them in like the traditional way and everything. And he actually made them at one point to kind of, because he remembers some of those makers, to talk to him about like, well, what do you remember about like Gordon Bullock's eel pots or Herman Green's eel pots or his grandfather's eel pots or whoever's, and they all had sort of little different things they did. So I think to somebody who maybe doesn't make them, you would look at them and say like, well, they all kind of look the same in terms of form and everything like that. But like Gordon Bullock's eel pots down at the base have like these little thin weavers, like narrow weavers at the base. Really nobody else does that. Everybody else has sort of the wider ones. Then you get up to the top and they shrink down. But he has a couple little narrow ones at the bottom that he did. Herman Green's pots are very like, for lack of a better term, I would call them workmanlike. There's no frills about them. They're just like kind of slapped together. And part of the reason that is because Herman, he was a commercial fisherman, but he got to the point where he got older where he couldn't go out and fish anymore. So to make money, he made eel pots. That's what he did. And he would sell them for 50 cents a piece back in like the 30s, 40s kind of time period. And if you think about like, that's, I mean, maybe that was some money then, but the amount of work that goes into those pots selling for 30, 40 cents a piece is crazy. So his look like that. And then Carl Newton, Boozy's grandfather's pots, have sort of a more, his mold was a little different, I think, than the other two makers, because they're a little, they look more bulbous, and they look a little squatter, although they measure the same height. I think what it is they're actually a little bit bigger around. Maybe it's like a half inch or an inch. I can't remember the exact measurement. But you can tell the mold he's making it on is significantly different enough from the other two that the pot looks different. So that's what I've noticed in that. And then in terms of the numbers of like historic examples I've looked at this point, we're getting into the range of 50 or so. And, I've got several in my own collection. Anytime I find one that's for sale, I'll buy it. If it's one of ours. And actually I buy other ones too, to kind of have some comparison to see like, what are the Eastern Shore ones looking like? What are the Piscataway ones looking like? And the other communities that make them. So I had the opportunity to buy about 20 Piscataway pots a couple of years ago. And I went ahead and did it. And these were pots that actually hadn't been fished. They had been made. They sat in a barn their whole lives. And those pots are interesting because, construction in many ways is the same. You got two pieces with the funnel and the body and everything. But their pots up at the top, the mouth is really constricted, like that big. Probably about like 3, maybe 3.5 inches in diameter. And really pulled in way more than what we do ours. Again, indicating either a different mold type, or maybe they're pulling it off the mold and weaving it tighter, at the top there. It's a little bit unclear because as far as I know, there's not a Piscataway eel pot maker left. And I've talked to them about, every Piscataway person I've met, I've been like, oh, y'all still make eel pots? And none of them do. They remember them, they just don't make them anymore. So Patawomeck pots, probably 50 or so that I've recorded and looked at. Other pots, when you start adding those in, you're getting up toward the 100 range. I just like to look at them, and anywhere I go, if I'm at a museum, I try to find them. And you'd be surprised where they show up. Like Denver Art Museum has examples of eel pots, which is crazy. I mean, it's like they're like far away from eels, but they've got eel pots. Frisco Native American Museum down on the Outer Banks has a few examples. Two of ours, and then they have some from other communities as well. And I bought a Patawomeck eel pot in an antique store in Winchester one time. And how it ended up in Winchester, when I saw it in the window, I knew what it was, because they've got a unique look, and it was tarred. I went in and asked the shop owner like where they got it, and evidently It was a guy that had been in the Marine Corps stationed at Quantico, and he had gotten it there. And I guess he retired or whatever right in Winchester. And that's how it ended up in Winchester. So I was like, well, there's the convenience. Like, that's what connects it to the region, you know. They'll turn up from time to time. And you can sometimes get them fairly cheap. So other times, like, you know, people want to charge you a lot for them.
Was eel tracking done upstream, say on the Rapidan or the North Anna?
As far as I know, not with split oak eel pots, but yes, eels were caught up there. And I think as you get further upriver, at least the folks that I've talked to who live upriver who talk about catching eels either did it with like a hook and line, you know, like it'd be almost like bycatch is what you consider it, or gigging, like spearing them.
You couldn't get them with baskets out of where?
I think you could. Yeah, I think you absolutely could. I just don't think it was like, because I think commercial, like the split oak pot really is part of that sort of commercial aspect of fishing. And so I think that's why, you know, it's so prevalent on, sort of below the fall line. But I think you could catch them.
Get back on the weir business for a moment that's where you referred to. The Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania National Military Park normally sponsors one float a year in the summer that starts at Jemena and goes to Ely's Forward and points out mainly Civil War related sites. But at one point, there is this V of stones in the river designed to channel the fish to a central point. And it's pretty much, I can't believe that people haven't moved those stones and gotten them back in place every now and then. But it's interesting to see, and you float right over it.
Yeah, and that's something I think that's interesting about those weirs, because I think they speak to not only indigenous presence on the landscape, but I think they also speak to the fact that like people have continuously used that place for maybe thousands of years, because I think a lot of those weirs are used in the historic period by non-indigenous groups. Because, I mean, if you're funneling fish to a spot, why would you not go catch those fish if you were anybody, you know?
Do you know Carol Nash?
I do, yeah.
Well, she talks now about people being buried so that it was sort of an overlook of a fishing site.
Yeah, on the Shenandoah River?
I thought it was in Orange and Spotsylvania County.
Okay. Good. I know there's,
Shenandoah, it's Shenandoah.
Is-
Because that's where because that's most of her work.
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, they're important landscapes. And I think, you know, some of Julie King's work, if you're following that sort of down in the lower Rappahannock region, I think they're seeing similar things where sight lines from burial sites to, in her case, villages are important. For Carol, it's those sight lines from, you know, the burial sites to maybe fishing spots that are important. But I think, you know, until recently, perhaps with the advent of GIS and all the stuff we can do with that, we haven't paid as much attention to that sort of thing because we've been very focused on like the dirt and the artifacts. And now we're starting to look at sort of larger landscape things. And so, yeah, looking at, you know, sight lines and what you can see and how things are related to one another in space is really becoming pretty important.
Has any of the Newton's collection been preserved somewhere?
Most of the Civil War stuff went to the Bull Run Winery, I think is the name of it. And they have like a big display of it down there. I think it's in their like lower floor. I haven't been to see it, to be honest with you. But that's where a lot of the Civil War stuff went. I do know.
I was just amazed when you mentioned that. I've been to the White Oak Museum twice, and I just saw a picture of it.
Oh, he had them in there. Yeah, he had eel pots in there. So you may not have gone, he kind of added stuff on over time. He had one whole section that was related to like commercial watermen in the community in the museum there that had like nets and, I can't remember if it had a boat or not, but it did have nets and stuff like that. And then as you came into the museum, if you were to like immediately turn right, he had cases of projectile points and he had, yeah, and when I went over there to learn how to make eel pots, he had, I think, 2 eel pots sitting there. and he had a couple duck decoys he had made out of reed as well, which were kind of cool. I thought I wish I had learned how to make those, but didn't get the chance to. American eel. Yeah, and American eel is the main kind of eel, like really the only kind of eel you're going to find up here in freshwater. Now you do see lampreys come up from time to time, which are like they're like a parasite kind of thing that come up on fish. But yeah, American eel. And the American eel is, like I said, lives in freshwater and goes to the Sargasso Sea to spawn. And they spawn in the same part of the sea as like the European eels do. But they ride the currents back to their separate homes as like little teeny like translucent glass eels. It's near Bermuda. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious about the fire in the middle of those, you know, for marshmallows.
Yeah. Well, it seems kind of dangerous to put a fire in the middle of a wooden boat, doesn't it? You know, I don't know. I'd have to get closer to that picture to see what they're doing. You know what I think that represents, and they talk about this in some of those early ethnohistoric accounts, is that they would burn a fire in those boats and when they would fish at night, and it would attract the fish to be speared. So I think that might be what that's, even though the image I think is supposed to be in the daytime, I think that specific part may be representing that kind of thing in there. And that was actually something that the Pamunkey did for a long time, even into the 20th century. They would hunt a bird down there called a sora, which is like a marsh, kind of like a marsh hen, like a bird that lives in the marsh. And they would hunt them at night. They would take people out to hunt them, and they would have this, on the end of their boat, they would have this like iron brazier they would burn a fire in, and that would, I guess, freeze those birds up so that they could shoot them at night. But yeah, I wouldn't want to burn an open fire in the middle of a dugout canoe. That's true. But if you let it get away, you're going to be swimming home. Yeah, go ahead.
Curiosity kills the ear. Simple question. Why does the eel just swim back out like a swim?
Well, the funnel trap has been around for literally tens of thousands of years in all human societies that fish. And in those tens of thousands of years, fish have never figured out how to swim back out of that funnel. Lucky for us. Otherwise, we wouldn't be eating fish. But part of it is that funnel, it's got fingers on it that kind of close to a point almost like that. And when that eel or fish gets in, he's in the body of the pot, he can't get out because he can't get out of where it's woven tight. And I think that funnel with those fingers sticking out just kind of discourages him from coming back into it. Yeah.
Second question, quickly. What's the size of the tribe nowadays?
We're right around 2,000 people. Yeah. And roughly 70% live right around White Oak. So within about 10 miles or so.
So Brad, I'm wondering about the Potomac tribe's attempt at achieving federal recognition.
Yeah. So, and I should have actually brought a little bit of that up at the beginning. I kind of introduced where we were geographically, but I didn't introduce maybe like who we are. So we're one of Virginia's 11 state recognized tribes. We've had state recognition since 2010, and we are currently pursuing federal recognition. Federal recognition is a long, drawn-out process, and there's a couple ways to go about it. There's actually 3 ways that you can go about it. There is the administrative path, which people think of these days as like the gold standard. The administrative path to federal recognition, which is where there are 7 federal recognition criteria, and you create a petition that addresses those 7 criteria, and the DIA and experts within the DIA evaluate that petition. That's been around since, I think, 1975. It's actually not that old, only about 50 years old. The other way that you can achieve federal recognition as an Indian community is through the legislative path. And in that case, that's where a bill is introduced into Congress. Congress votes on it, and then it's signed into law, and it recognizes the tribe as like a federally recognized Indian tribe. Then there's a third path to federal recognition that's called the judicial route. It's really rare, generally has to do with sort of land disputes that are held in courts. And in that sense, tribe can be recognized through a ruling in a court. It's really rare. So anyway, we're in the process right now Of the 11 state recognized tribes in Virginia, 7 have federal recognition currently. The first to achieve federal recognition was the Patawomeck tribe. It took them roughly 30 years. They went through the administrative route, which is like the long, drawn out, like heavily scrutinized process. The other 6 that have federal recognition went through the legislative route. They had a bill introduced, and that bill recognized those 6 tribes. And that was done, Pamunkey gained federal recognition, I believe, in 2015, if I'm remembering right. The other 6 tribes gained federal recognition in 2018, I think, if I'm remembering right. You can Google that. I might not be exactly right on those dates, but I'm pretty sure. The legislative route that the 6 tribes took them roughly 18 years, from when they started to when the bill finally got passed. We are pursuing sort of a dual path toward federal recognition. So we are gathering information for a petition, working to craft a petition for the BIA, and we are also moving through the legislative process. So we had a bill introduced a couple years ago by our current governor-elect, who was our representative at the time, Abigail Spanberger, to recognize Patawomeck Indian tribe. And we obviously have a new representative now, Eugene Vindman, and he introduced a bill to recognize the tribe last year. And so that goes into the Natural Resources Committee. Then at that, it would be in there. It would go into the Resources Committee to the Congress, it would get voted on there, and then it would go to the Senate and get voted on there. But again, it takes a long time to do it, and during that time, you can be called up to DC to testify within front of these committees and in front of Congress numerous times, which happened with the other tribes as well. So, we're like 3 years into the process. We're hoping that because 6 tribes have gotten it through the legislative process before, it took them 18 years, it'd be nice to shave off a couple years, but there is no guarantee. And things take as long as they take, and I think we are all aware of how the government works. I work for the federal government, and I know how slow things move. So.
The other couple of tribes, are they also doing?
The ones that don't have federal recognition? There's, three besides us, yeah. So the Mattaponi have just submitted a petition to the BIA. It's unclear how long that will take. They have a time period for comments and review and all that kind of stuff. So their petition has been submitted, and there's 2 reservation tribes in Virginia, the Pamunkey and the Mattaponi. So the Pamunkey have federal recognition already. The Mattaponi are going for it through the administrative process now. And then the other 2 tribes that are state recognized are the Nottoway and the Cherokee Nottoway. And both of them are down in Southampton County, Virginia. So pretty far south Virginia. And they, I believe, are both also going through the legislative route as well. I believe they've both got bills in Congress now. Yep.
So we may have to, going to testify. What kind of questions are they looking at?
Questions about history, culture, things like that, and then of course you never know what you might get. I suppose when you're up there, the transcripts of the other hearings are available. Obviously, like it's public record, so you can look at it. But a lot of it had to do with like expert witnesses testifying. So like anthropologists, archaeologists, historians, and then also like leadership of the tribe. Talking about things like, do you have a constitution? Like, what does it look like? And, how has your community maintained cohesion over the years? And, sort of questions like that.
It just seems like so many givens that you would think you would have to prove.
Oh, no. I mean, it's kind of the way it is. And the state recognition process in many ways has changed a lot over time, but sort of mirrors it in some ways. So there's testimony that's given in front of the House of Delegates and there's, Commonwealth Senate and everything. There are also like portions of petitions that are filled out and evaluated. And so, it's sort of a process that mirrors it, although the federal process tends to be more bureaucratic, and the people that evaluate it, I think, are drawn from different places than like the state recognition petitions might have been in the past. But state recognition in Virginia has only been around since 1983. Point that out too. So again, like tribes being recognized in Virginia is not a very old thing. in that sense, at least. Now, the Mattaponi and Pamunkey have been recognized because they've been paying tribute to the governor for literally hundreds, like before this was a country. So, they've been recognized in that kind of way, but as like official, like you are a state recognized tribe, that's only been around since 1983.
What are the benefits of recognition, both at a state and federal level?
Yeah, well, so at the state level, you have like, I think a lot of people think, and this goes for recognition both at the state and the federal level. I think there's a lot of people that think like state recognition entitles people to like draw paychecks or like do this, that, or the other. And actually, that's not true. That's not what recognition is. Recognition provides opportunities to go for things like grants that might not be available to other groups. But you still have to do the work of writing the grant and, performing the grant and doing the grant report and all that kind of stuff. But, for us, especially as it comes to federal recognition, what's important to us is the opportunities that we provide for healthcare, for housing, and for education within our community. And, beyond that, recognition is important because it recognizes the relationship between the government, whether it's the state or the federal government, and the tribal nation, that sovereign status that we all have. So that's really, the overarching important part of recognition, but in terms of like the material aspects of it, recognition is both a lot of work and creates a lot of work if you achieve it. So it's really like, it's asking to have more work put on you in some ways. And it's a tough process and an invasive process too. I mean, there are a lot of tribes who don't go for recognition because they don't want to be put through that kind of process because it's so invasive. So it's a decision that every community has to make on their own.
Yeah, it's thanks to Plecker.
Partially, Plecker and others. I mean, Virginia's had a lot of racial laws since the 17th century. So, I mean, that's been something that has been tough for Virginia Indians all along. But yeah, Plecker, perhaps the most recent one, starting in the 1920s and on up into the 1967, Loving versus Virginia reversed that Racial Integrity Act stuff. So, yeah.
You are the chief.
No, I'm not the chief. I am on the council. I'm the chief judge on the council.
Well, now, is the chief elected
Yes, chief is elected.
to amend the vote?
Everybody. Well, everybody over 18 votes. That's how we do it. Now, and that's different. Every tribe has their own constitution, and they may do it a different way, but that's how we do ours.
Because I know some tribes particularly have it left only the women vote.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard to say, because of sort of the lack of records from that early period and what the English were recording, like what individual communities were organized like. I think we get a lot of, historical documentation from the sort of southern Virginia groups, like Powhatan focused groups. But when you get to groups like the Monacan or like the Patawomeck or Susquehannocks maybe to some extent, or, groups like that aren't really like at the heart of that Jamestown story, there's a little bit less that's recorded. And so we're not really sure exactly how those governments function. And arguably, I would say we're not even really that sure about how the Powhatan government functioned. I mean, we see it from John Smith's eyes and other like English people's eyes, but they weren't sitting in on those council meetings, or if they even called them council meetings or whatever they call them. Like, they weren't sitting in those spaces. They didn't know, they didn't speak the language, so they didn't really know what that was like. So I think we have an impression of what we think it should be, but I think it's good that every community can kind of like have their own way of doing it, because it allows that community to do what's best for them and what's worked, over time.